Used as a coloring agent in products ranging from colas and beer to gravies and soy sauce, caramel coloring may be the world's most widely consumed food coloring, helping to sell over 1 billion servings a day. Unfortunately, the manufacture of certain artificial caramel colorings can lead to the formation of carcinogens, such as 4-methylimidazole, which causes cancer in mice, but not rats, or at least not male rats, but it's unclear whether humans are more like mice or rats in terms of their response to the carcinogen. To be safe, California officially listed it as a carcinogen and started requiring warning labels on soft drinks containing more than 29 micrograms per can. The soft drink industry was unsuccessful in opposing the action, so were forced to reduce carcinogen levels in their products, but only in California. Buy Coke anywhere else, it may have up to 5 times the limit. Remember Coca-Cola's Tab Clear, though, or Crystal Pepsi? Clearly, they can do away with carcinogenic colorings altogether. In a scathing expose of the USDA's new meat inspection program, the Washington Post quoted a representative from the Inspectors Union who said pig processing lines may be moving too quickly to catch tainted meat. Tremendous amounts of fecal matter remain on the carcasses, he said, not small bits, but chunks. What about the other white meat? The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine created this infographic to highlight what they consider to be the 5 worst contaminants in chicken products. In their investigation of retail chicken products in 10 U.S. cities, they found fecal contamination in about half the chicken they bought at the store. But with all the focus on what's in chicken products, we may have lost sight on what may be missing, like actual chicken. Researchers recently published an autopsy of chicken nuggets in the American Journal of Medicine. The purpose was to determine the contents of chicken nuggets from 2 national food chains. Because chicken nuggets are a favorite of children, and the obesity epidemic now extends to them as well, the researchers thought knowing a bit more about the content of the contemporary chicken nugget could be important. The nugget from the first restaurant was composed of approximately 50% skeletal muscle, with the remainder composed primarily of fat, with some blood vessels and nerve present, along with generous quantities of skin or gut lining and associated supportive tissue. The nugget from the second restaurant was composed of approximately 40% skeletal muscle, with lots of other tissues, including bone. "I was floored," said the lead researcher. He'd read what other reports had said is in them, and didn't believe it. He was astonished actually seeing it under the microscope. They conclude that actual chicken meat was not the predominant component of either nugget. It was mostly other tissues, concluding the term chicken nugget is really a misnomer. Health authorities from all over the world universally recommend increasing consumption of whole grains and legumes, beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, for health promotion. But what about the phytates? Phytate is a naturally occurring compound found in all plant seeds, so botanically that means all beans, grains, nuts, and seeds. Over the decades, phytate has been badly maligned as a mineral absorption inhibitor. That's why, for example, you hear advice to roast, sprout, or soak your nuts to get rid of phytates, so we can absorb more minerals like calcium. The concern about phytates in bone health arose from a series of laboratory experiments performed on puppies, published in 1949, suggesting high phytate diets have a bone-softening and anti-calcifying effect. Subsequent studies on rats, in which they fed them the equivalent of 10 loaves of bread a day, confirmed phytate status as a so-called anti-nutrient. But more recently, in light of actual human data, phytate's image has undergone a makeover. If you put people on a high phytate diet and measure their calcium balance, their bodies appear to become accustomed to the extra phytate over time, and it all worked out. But this study was done on only 3 people. So I was glad to see this study published, which asked the simple question, do people who avoid high phytate foods, legumes, nuts, and whole grains, have better bone mineral density? No, in fact quite the opposite. Those that consume more high phytate foods had stronger bones, as measured in the heel, spine, and hip. The researchers conclude that dietary phytate consumption had protective effects against osteoporosis, and that low phytate consumption may instead be considered an osteoporosis risk factor. This is consistent with reports that phytate can inhibit the dissolving of bone similar to anti-osteoporosis drugs like Fosamax. A follow-up study found the same thing, improved bone density in those that consumed the most phytates. But this is the most convincing study to date, actually measuring phytate levels flowing through women's bodies and following their bone mass over time. And women with the highest phytate levels had the lowest levels of bone loss in their spine and their hip, and so no surprise that those that ate the most phytates were estimated to have significantly lower risk of major fracture and lower risk of hip fracture specifically. This is thought to be in part because phytates help block the formation of bone-eating cells in their bone-eating activity. You can see how much more bone is eaten away in the non-phytate group on the left. Now, the drug Fosamax can have a similar beneficial effect, but phytates don't have the side effects associated with this class of bisphosphonate drugs, side effects like osteonecrosis. There's a rare side effect associated with this class of drugs called osteonecrosis of the jaw. And the whole reason people take these drugs is to protect their bones, but by doing so may also risk rotting them away. Type 2 diabetes is becoming a world pandemic. We know the consumption of eggs is related to the development of some other chronic diseases. What about diabetes? Researchers found a stepwise increase in risk the more and more eggs people ate. Eating just a single egg a week appeared to increase the odds of diabetes by 76%. 2 eggs a week appeared to double the odds, and just a single egg a day triple the odds. 3 times greater risk of type 2 diabetes, one of the leading causes of death and amputations, blindness, and kidney failure. This is not the first time a link between eggs and diabetes has been reported. In 2009, Harvard researchers found that a single egg a day or more was associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes in men and women, and that finding has since also been confirmed in other populations, Asia in 2011 and Europe in 2012. And the high consumption of eggs associated with diabetes risk was less than 1 a day. Though it appears you have to start early, once you get into your 70s, avoiding eggs may not help. Once we then have diabetes, eggs may hasten our death. Eating 1 egg a day or more appears to shorten anyone's lifespan, but may double the all-cause mortality for those with diabetes. Not good news for the egg industry. From a transcript of a closed meeting I found through the Freedom of Information Act, given the rate at which obesity and incidence of type 2 diabetes is growing in the U.S., any association between dietary cholesterol and type 2 diabetes could be a showstopper that could overshadow the positive attributes of eggs. Carbohydrate means basically hydrated carbon dioxide, and water, which is what plants use to make carbs with, and that's all that's left after we then burn them for energy to power our muscles and brain. But this process of oxidizing carbs to make energy is messy and generates free radicals, such that if we chug down straight sugar water, the level of oxidation in our bloodstream goes up over the next few hours. Why would our bodies evolve to have a negative reaction to our primary fuel? Because over our millions of years of evolution, there was no such thing as sugar water. All sugars and starches came prepackaged with what? With antioxidants. In nature, sugar always comes with phytonutrients. If you drink the same amount of sugar in the form of orange juice, you don't get that spike in oxidation. Why? Because the sugar in fruit comes prepackaged with antioxidants. Can't we just drink vitamin C-enriched sugar water? No, it wasn't the vitamin C in the OJ, but the citrus phytonutrients like asparagine and naringenin that beat back the oxidation. If we don't eat phytonutrient-rich plant foods with every meal, like fruit, then for hours after we eat, our bodies are tipped out of balance into a pro-oxidative state, which can then set us up for oxidant stress diseases. The free radicals in our body can oxidize the fats in our blood, for example, and set us up for heart disease. Here's the levels of oxidized fat in our blood 1 to 3 hours after sugar water ingestion, and the corresponding drop in vitamin E levels in our blood as our body's antioxidant stores are used up within hours. If we don't eat phytonutrient foods with our meals, our body has to dip into its backup supply of antioxidants, and you can't get away with that for long. So, while ideally we should stuff our faces with as many phytonutrient-rich foods as we can, in the very least, we should eat enough antioxidants to counter the oxidation of digestion. At the very least, we don't want to slide backwards every day and end up with fewer antioxidants in our bodies than we woke up with. Just to break even, here's about how many antioxidants we need every day, depending on how much we eat, just to counter the oxidation of digestion. This is measured in millimoles of Trolox equivalents. Men in the U.S. average about 2,500 calories a day, and so should be getting at least 11,000 micromoles a day. Women who eat about 1,800 calories on average, so should get at least 8,000 just to stay solvent. The average American doesn't even get half the minimum. No wonder oxidant stress-related diseases abound. We're getting so few antioxidants in our diet, we can't even keep up with the free radicals created just digesting our meals. We are a nation in chronic oxidative debt. In developed societies, we eat a lot of food, but not enough plants, which could result in exaggerated and prolonged metabolic, oxidative, and immune imbalance, presenting opportunity for biological insult that over time could supersede biological defense and repair systems, manifesting in cellular dysfunction, disease, and ultimately death. To get up to our daily minimum of 8,000 to 11,000 antioxidant units a day, all we have to do is eat lots of fruits and vegetables, right? Well, let's see. Let's say I ate a whole banana for breakfast, in addition to whatever else I ate. Lunch included the typical American salad, iceberg lettuce, half cup of cucumber slices, canned peaches for dessert. Supper included a side serving of peas and carrots, and a half cup of snap peas, along with yet another salad, and a cup of watermelon for dessert. I just ate 9 servings of fruits and vegetables, feeling all good about myself, and I only made it up to about 2,700, less than a quarter of the way to my minimum daily recommended intake. What am I supposed to do, eat 36 servings a day? Well, what if instead of that banana, I had a single serving of blueberries for breakfast? Whoa, we got to squish down the scale here. And instead of iceberg lettuce for that afternoon salad, 4 leaves of red leaf lettuce. Maybe throw some kidney beans on top, maybe a teaspoon of dried oregano as a bonus, an apple and some dates for a snack. It's not even supper time. I really just did 5 servings, and I've left the minimum recommended daily intake of antioxidants in the dust. That's why it's not just the quantity of fruits and veggies that matters, but quality. We should try to choose the healthiest ones. So if we do that, can we now skip fruits and veggies for supper? Never even made it there. Not a good idea. Note these estimated minimum antioxidant needs do not take into account the added amounts needed if other oxidant stressors are present, such as meat consumption if we're sick, cigarette smoke, air pollution, sleep deprivation. Then just to stay out of oxidative debt, we'd have to consume a lot more than the minimum. Remember that cool argon laser study? Their most important finding was that antioxidant levels can plummet within 2 hours of a stressful event. It takes 2 hours to lose, but can take up to 3 days to get our levels back up again. So the take-home message is that especially when we're sick, stressed, or tired, to go above and beyond the minimum 8,000 to 11,000, ideally we need to be soaking our bloodstream with antioxidants, which means high-powered fruits and vegetables at every meal, like berries or beans, and sipping something like green tea or hibiscus all day long. The postprandial state is a pro-oxidant state, meaning that after each meal, free radicals are produced as our body assimilates the food, and so we can't just have a bowl of berries in the morning to meet our minimum daily antioxidant needs and call it a day. Each and every meal should contain high antioxidant foods, which, if you remember, means plants. Antioxidant-rich foods originate from the plant kingdom. This is due to the thousands of natural antioxidant compounds found naturally in plant foods. So, for example, consuming fruits, which are high in phenolic phytonutrients, increases the antioxidant capacity of the blood, and when they're consumed with the standard American diet, high-fat, refined carbohydrate, pro-oxidant, pro-inflammatory meals, they may help counterbalance some of the negative effects. Given the content and availability of fat and sugars in the Western diet, regular consumption of phenolic-rich foods, particularly in conjunction with meals, appears to be a prudent strategy to maintain oxidative balance and health. And of all fruits, berries may be the best. So for example, here's the spike in oxidation caused by a Mediterranean meal of pasta, tomato sauce, olive oil, and fried fish. Obviously not enough tomatoes. Add a glass of red wine, which contains berry phytonutrients from grapes, and we can bring down the level of oxidation, but not blunt it completely. So the meal needs even more plants. In this study, they gave people standard breakfast items, resulting in lots of oxidized cholesterol in their bloodstream 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours after the meal. But all it took was a cup of strawberries with that same breakfast to at least keep the meal from contributing to further oxidation. Note, though, without the strawberries, look where we'd be at lunchtime. Right? Let's say we ate a standard American diet at 6 a.m., right? Then 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, noon. If we didn't eat that cup of strawberries with breakfast, by the time lunch rolls around, we'd already be starting out in a hyperoxidized state and could just make things worse. Since Western eating patterns include eating multiple meals a day, including snacks, one can only speculate on the level of biological unrest. But at least if we had some berries for breakfast, we'd be starting out at baseline for lunch. This acute protection is likely due to the antioxidant effects of the strawberry phytonutrients. Even better than baseline, how about our meal actually improving our antioxidant status? Here's measuring the antioxidant level of one's bloodstream after a crappy meal. It drops, using up our antioxidant stores. But eat a big bunch of red grapes with the meal, and the antioxidant level of our bloodstream goes up, such that our body's in a positive antioxidant balance for a few hours. Right? Same thing after enough blueberries. And imagine if these ensuing hours between our next meal, right, we were sipping green tea or hibiscus, right, we'd have this nice antioxidant surplus all day long. What, according to the researchers, are the practical implications? These data provide an interesting perspective for advising individuals on food choices when consuming a moderate to high-fat meal is unavoidable. Unavoidable? So if we're locked in a fast food joint or something, well, then they suggest chasing whatever we're forced to eat with some berries. Right? It reminds me of those studies on smokers I talked about, suggesting those who smoke should eat lots of kale and broccoli to reduce the oxidative damage to their DNA, or they could just not smoke. In a single day, the systemic stress of all that fat in our blood and redox imbalance, being in a mild pro-oxidant state after meals, may seem trivial. Over time, however, these daily insults can lead to complicated atherosclerosis, contributing to hundreds of thousands of deaths a year. We know from the work of Drs. Ornish and Esselstyn that switching to a plant-based diet can reverse heart disease, open up arteries, in some cases without drugs, without surgery. But because our first symptom of heart disease may be our last, sudden cardiac death, it's best not to wait until atherosclerosis progresses that far. To predict the risk of dying from a heart attack, sure, we can measure risk factors, such as cholesterol levels and blood pressure, but wouldn't it be nice to actually see what's going on inside our arteries before it's too late? Well, our imaging technologies are so good now that we can, But the required dose of radiation delivered to the chest is so high that a young woman getting just a single scan, for example, may increase her lifetime risk of breast cancer and lung cancer by between around 1 and 4%. Our carotid arteries, though, which connect our heart to our brain, come close enough to the surface in our necks that we can visualize the arterial wall using harmless sound waves with ultrasound. OK, so how do the arteries of those eating plant-based diets compare to those eating the standard American diet? Researchers found some vegans and found out. Here's the standard American diet group. This is the thickness of the inner wall of their carotid arteries, where the atherosclerotic plaque builds up, considered a predictor of all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. That same inner layer was significantly slimmer in vegans, but so were the vegans themselves. Those eating the standard American diet were on average overweight, with a BMI over 26, while the vegans were a trim 21. That's 36 pounds lighter on average. So maybe the only reason those eating meat, eggs, and dairy had thickened arterial walls was because they were themselves overweight. Maybe the diet per se had nothing to do with it directly. To solve the riddle, one would have to find a group still eating the standard American diet, but as slim as a vegan. To find a group that fit and trim in our society, they had to use long-distance endurance athletes, who ate the same crappy American diet, but ran an average of 48 miles per week for 21 years. You run almost 2 marathons a week for 20 years, you can be as slim as a vegan no matter what you eat. So where did they fall on the graph? Both the vegans and the conventional diet group were sedentary, less than an hour of exercise a week. The endurance runners were here. So it appears if you run an average of about 1,000 miles a year, you can rival some couch potato vegans. Doesn't mean you can't do both, though, but it may be easier to just eat plants. This is not the only study to look at the arterial walls of those eating plant-based diets. This new study from China, for example, found that compared to omnivores, those that ate egg-free and meat-free diets, had all the typical benefits of eating more plant-based: lower body mass index, blood pressure, triglycerides, total cholesterol, bad cholesterol, fewer free radicals, maybe better kidney function, better blood sugar control, etc. But does all that translate to actual differences in their arteries? Yes, indeed, the omnivores had comparatively thickened arterial linings, all of which suggests about a tripling in their probability of developing cardiovascular disease. They therefore recommend that more vegetables should be eaten instead of meat, and it's never too late to improve one's diet. Having said that, if those on plant-based diets don't get enough vitamin B12, levels of an artery-damaging compound called homocysteine can start to rise in the bloodstream and may counteract some of the benefits of eating healthy. In this study from Taiwan, the arteries of vegetarians was just as stiff as those of the omnivores, and they had the same level of thickening in their carotid arteries, perhaps because of the elevated homocysteine levels in their blood. The negative findings of these studies should not be considered as evidence of neutral cardiovascular effects of vegetarianism, but do indicate an urgent need for modification of vegan diets through vitamin B12 fortification or supplements. Vitamin B12 deficiency is a very serious problem, leading ultimately to anemia, neuropsychiatric disorders, irreversible nerve damage, and these high levels of artery-damaging homocysteine in the blood. Prudent vegans should include sources of vitamin B12 in their diets. One study of vegetarians whose B12 levels were really hurting even had thicker, more dysfunctional arteries than the omnivores. How do we know B12 was to blame? Well, when they were given B12 supplements, they got better. Their arterial lining started to shrink back, and the proper functioning of their arteries returned. Without B12-fortified foods or B12 supplements, when omnivores are switched to a vegan diet, they develop vitamin B12 deficiency. Yes, it may take dropping down to around 150 picomoles per liter to develop classic signs of B12 deficiency, like the anemia and our spinal cord rotting from the inside out. But way before that, we may start getting increased risk of cognitive deficits and brain shrinkage and stroke and depression and nerve and bone damage, as well as having our homocysteine shoot through the roof. And that may attenuate the beneficial effects of a vegetarian diet on cardiovascular health. The beneficial effects of vegetarian diets on cholesterol and blood sugars need to be advocated, but at the same time, efforts to correct vitamin B12 deficiency in vegetarian diets can never be overestimated. For disease prevention and health maintenance, berries of all colors have emerged as champions. Most of the work is focused on cancer prevention and treatment. Studies have shown the anti-cancer effects of berries are partially mediated through their abilities to counteract, reduce, and also repair damage resulting from oxidative stress and inflammation. They may also boost detoxifying enzymes, a bunch of other things, but this is new. The effects of blueberry ingestion on natural killer cell counts. Natural killer cells are part of our immune system's rapid response team against cancer cells, taking them out through the activation of cancer cell suicide via death receptors. They're called natural killers because they don't require activation by prior exposure. You don't want to have to wait until your second tumor before your immune system starts fighting. We have about 2 billion of these soldiers circulating in our bloodstream at any one time, but we may be able to get a troop surge with blueberries. They had athletes eat about 1.5 cups a day for 6 weeks to see if blueberries could reduce the oxidative stress of long-distance running. And indeed, that's what they saw, no surprise, a blunting of the spike in oxidative stress. But that's not what sets this study apart. The number of natural killer cells in the blood typically decreases after prolonged endurance exercise, dropping by half to only about 1 billion, unless you've been eating lots of blueberries, in which case you end up here, because 6 weeks of blueberries doubled the number of natural killer cells, up to over 4 billion. This has never been demonstrated in humans consuming blueberries. Well, no one's ever looked before. There was a study done on goji berries, and despite a cup a day for a month, there was no significant change in the number of natural killer cells. There was a study, though, that showed a significant increase in natural killer cell activity thanks to the spice cardamom. Cardamom and blueberries. I never thought we'd be fighting cancer with blueberry muffins, but check this out. You take some lymphoma cells in a petri dish and you add cardamom, and nothing happens. If, however, you add some natural killers, and about 5% of the cancer cells are wiped out. But then you add a little cardamom, and your troops do a little better. And then if you add more, and all of a sudden, same number of natural killer cells, but they're now able to kill off 10 times more cancer cells. And remember, cardamom alone, even at the highest dose, had no effect on cancer cells, but it really seemed to enhance our NK cells' killer instincts. The same thing found for black pepper. Black pepper alone, nothing, and a little black pepper, no effect, but with enough there seemed to be a boosting effect, up around 30 or 40% cancer cell clearance. And if you add them both together, they appear to synergize and kind of work even better together. Taken together, these data strongly suggest that black pepper and cardamom have the potential to markedly enhance the anti-cancer activity of natural killer cells. And then imagine if you had twice as many in your bloodstream, thanks to this study, brought to you by, of course, the North American Blueberry Council and the North Carolina Blueberry Council. But then the last sentence is my favorite. There were no conflicts of interest. Increased fish consumption of mothers before and during pregnancy leads to increased exposure to both mercury and the long-chain omega-3 DHA. Mercury may negatively affect brain development in one's unborn baby, whereas DHA may stimulate brain development. As we saw, though, the results of this study showed that the negative effect of mercury outweighs the beneficial effect of DHA for most species of fish. Unfortunately, in the last two national surveys of women of childbearing age, they were less aware and knowledgeable about this problem than other women, despite FDA and EPA campaigns to inform every OBGYN and pediatrician in the United States about the potential risks of mercury in fish. But I wanted to highlight the before, not just during pregnancy, but even before one gets pregnant. Since mercury sticks around, women may want to avoid polluted fish consumption for a year before they get pregnant, in addition to just during pregnancy. The reason they suggest a year before getting pregnant is because the half-life of mercury in the body is estimated to be about 2 months. They fed folks 2 servings a week of tuna and other high-mercury fish to push their mercury levels up, and then stopped the fish at week 14, and slowly but surely their levels came back down. I know a lot of moms are concerned about exposing their children to mercury-containing vaccines, but if they just ate a single serving a week or less of fish during pregnancy, the latest data shows their infants end up with substantially more mercury in their bodies than getting injected with up to 6 mercury-containing vaccines. But with a 2-month half-life, within a year of stopping fish consumption, your body can detox nearly 99% of the mercury. Unfortunately, the other industrial pollutants in fish can take longer for a body to get rid of. Half-life as long as 10 years for certain dioxins and PCBs and DDT metabolites found in fish. So to get that same 99% drop could take 120 years, which is a long time to delay one's first child. What do these other pollutants do? Well, high concentrations of industrial contaminants associated with 38 times the odds of diabetes. That's as strong as the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Isn't diabetes mostly about obesity, though? Well, these are fat-soluble pollutants, and so as people get fatter, the retention and toxicity of persistent organic pollutants related to the risk of diabetes may increase, suggesting the shocking possibility that obesity may only be a vehicle for such chemicals. We may be storing pollutants in our spare tire like a hazardous waste dump. Now, the pollutants could just be a marker of animal product consumption. Maybe that's why there's such higher diabetes risk, since more than 90% of persistent organic pollutants come from animal foods, unless you work in a chemical factory or stumble across some toxic waste. And indeed, in the U.S., every serving of fish a week is associated with a 5% increased risk of diabetes, which makes fish consumption about 80% worse than red meat. Glaucoma is the second leading cause of legal blindness in white women, but the #1 cause of blindness in African American women. That's one reason researchers chose a population of African American women to study the effects of fruit and vegetable consumption on glaucoma risk. But the other reason is because they were specifically interested in foods with the highest concentration of those eye-protecting phytonutrients like zeaxanthin, kale, and collard greens. But you'd be lucky if you could find 1 in 10 white people eating even a single serving a month, whereas that was a no-brainer for African Americans. What'd they find? Well, as I've stressed over the years, all fruits and vegetables are not the same. Whether you ever ate bananas or had 1 or more bananas every day didn't seem to matter much, but eating a couple oranges every week was associated with dramatically lower risk. Not orange juice, though. You can drink orange juice every day, and it didn't seem to matter. A similar finding with peaches. Fresh peaches seemed to work, but canned peaches didn't. Similarly, vegetables in general as a catch-all term didn't seem to matter. For example, whether you ate a green salad twice a week, once a week, or 0 times a week didn't seem to matter when it came to reducing glaucoma risk. But you know how pitiful most people's salads are. Here's the kale and collard greens. Check it out. Just 2 or 3 servings a month was associated with half the risk of glaucoma compared to once a month or less. White people take note, as you may need it even more. The lighter our eye color, the more greens we need to eat. Blue eyes let 100 times more light through, so people with blue or gray eyes appear significantly more vulnerable to damage compared to brown or black, with green and hazel somewhere in the middle. It's interesting, carrots appear to be less protective in black women compared to white women. They suggest it could be differences in food preparation methods. Perhaps the African-American subjects tended to eat carrots raw, limiting the absorption of certain nutrients, while they chopped and prepared their collard greens with oil, making the nutrients more bioavailable, because the absorption of carotenoid phytonutrients depends on the presence of fat, which is why I encourage people to eat nuts or seeds with their greens, a little tahini sauce or something. Why not just take a zeaxanthin pill? Well, we don't know what exactly it is in these wonderful foods that's working their wonders, so it may be better to just recommend folks eat them rather than supplements. And in fact, people that take calcium or iron supplements may be doubling, quadrupling, or even septupling their odds of glaucoma. Better to just get most of our nutrients from produce, not pills. Anyone who's ever got a sunburn knows how damaging the UV rays in sunlight can be. Imagine what those rays are doing to the back of our eyeballs, our retinas. The eye is designed to take sunlight and focus it like a magnifying glass into the back of our eyes. Thankfully, we have a layer of cells in our eye called the retinal pigment epithelium that supports and protects our delicate retinal eyesight machinery. This layer builds up yellow plant pigments from our diet, like zeaxanthin, which absorbs blue light and protects the retina from photooxidative damage. The yellowing of our corneas when we get cataracts may actually be our body's defense mechanism to protect our retinas. In fact, when we go and surgically remove those cataracts, our risk of blindness from macular degeneration shoots up since we've removed that protection. Instead of trading one type of vision loss for another, instead of pigmenting the front of our eye with cataracts, better to pigment the back of our eyes with diet. The pigment in the back of our eye is entirely of dietary origin, thus suggesting that the most common cause of going blind in the Western world could be delayed or even averted with appropriate dietary modification. Where in our diet do we get it? Well, the egg industry brags that eggs are a good source, but have an egg nearly every day, 6 eggs a week for 3 months, and the pigmentation in our eyes barely moves. And these were the high lutein, free-range, certified organic eggs, not purchased at the supermarket, but from a local farm. Instead of getting phytonutrients from the egg that came from the chicken, that came from the corn and blades of grass she pecked on, what about getting it from the source? A cup of corn and a half cup of spinach a day for 3 months. A dramatic boost in protective eye pigment. Just to compare to the eggs, here's the best that eggs can do. But if you cut out the middle hen and get these nutrients from plants directly, you can get up to here. What's also so neat about this study is that they went back and measured the levels 3 months after the study stopped, and the levels were still way up here. So once we build our macular pigment up with a healthy diet, our eyeballs really try to hold on to it. So even if we go on vacation and end up eating more iceberg lettuce than spinach, our eyes will hold out until we get back. Yes, eyes can increase zeaxanthin levels in the blood, but they also raise bad cholesterol levels and risk of heart disease. Therefore, an egg yolk-based dietary strategy to increase plasma zeaxanthin cannot be recommended. An alternative, cholesterol-free food source is desirable, like goji berries, for example, which have up to 60 times more zeaxanthin than eggs. Modest dose markedly increases levels in our body. An inexpensive, effective, safe, whole food strategy to increase zeaxanthin in our bloodstream. But we don't need it in our blood, we need it in our eyes. So how about a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial? To preserve eyesight in the elderly in traditional Chinese medicine, people are often prescribed 40 to 100 goji berries a day. But here they just used 15 berries a day for 3 months. But still found it could protect against loss of pigment and prevent the buildup of what's called soft drusen, which is just debris that builds up in the back of our eye, both of which are associated with age-related macular degeneration, the leading cause of legal blindness in older men and women, affecting more than 10 million Americans. Now note, they gave the berries with milk in this study, so the butterfat could increase the absorption of these carotenoid pigments. A healthier way to get the same effect would be to just eat goji berries with nuts or seeds. In other words, goji trail mix. Once we preserve the pigment in our retinal pigment epithelial cells, we need to keep them alive, which may be where anthocyanin phytonutrients come in. Anthocyanins, from the Greek anthos, meaning flower, and kyanos, meaning blue, blue flower, are natural plant pigments that make pansies look purple, and turns green cabbage into purple cabbage, yellow corn into purple corn, brown rice to purple rice, white potatoes to blue potatoes, orange carrots to purple carrots, and turns blueberries into, well, blueberries, and keeps blackberries black. As we age, our critical RPE layer starts to break down, but we may be able to decelerate that aging with blueberries. Here are human RPE cells in a petri dish exposed to various stressors. The ones bathed in blueberry anthocyanins had fewer free radicals and a lower proportion of aged cells, suggesting that blueberries and these other red, blue, purple pigmented fruits and vegetables may help prevent age-related macular degeneration. And blueberries may be especially important for blue eyes, as we saw in an earlier video. Preventing is nice, but what if we already have a disease like glaucoma, an incurable eye disease in which our optic nerve, which connects our eyes to our brain, starts deteriorating, we start losing our visual fields. A few years ago, Japanese researchers showed that they could apparently halt the progression of disease with black currants. They gave people black currants for 6 months, significantly boosting the blood flow to their optic nerve. The results suggested that black currants might be a safe and valuable option, but it was not double-blind, no control group, so I didn't report it when it was initially published, but here we go, finally. Glaucoma patients split into 2 groups. Half got black currants, the other half didn't. Let's see what happened. Here's a measure of the deterioration of their visual fields in both groups in the 2 years leading up to the beginning of the study. Worse, 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 despite taking the best glaucoma drugs on the market. Then the study starts. The berry-free control group continued to worsen, but the berries appeared to stop the disease in its tracks. 1 year later, 2 years later, and since there's no downside, only good side effects to berries, in my professional opinion, everyone with glaucoma should be eating berries every day. What happens to our eyesight if we sit in front of a computer all day? In previous years, the rapid spread of computers in the home and workplace has led to an increase in ocular and visual problems, including eye discomfort, blurring of distant objects, eye strain, and visual fatigue, so-called near-work-induced transient myopia. That's when, after staring at a computer screen for a while, you look out the window and things start out all blurry. That's because our poor little ciliary muscles pulling at the lenses in our eyes are locked in this constant state of contraction to keep that near focus. Over the time, this can have long-term adverse consequences. Yes, we could waste 4 to 12 minutes an hour taking breaks staring out the window, but what if you've got nutrition videos to make? The effects of black currant intake on video display terminal work-induced transient refractive alteration in healthy humans. A double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study finding a significant improvement in refractive values and eye strain symptoms compared to placebo. Note what passes for currants in the U.S. are actually champagne grape raisins, not actual black currants, which were banned in the U.S. a century ago at the behest of the lumber industry, for fear that they might spread a plant disease that affects white pine, which we hardly even harvest anymore. They are, however, currently making a comeback, though any anthocyanin-rich berry might have similar benefits. For example, there was a previous study done on bilberries. Why didn't I report on it when it came out? Because I can't read Japanese. Why not just take bilberry powder capsules? Because as we've seen over and over, when you test supplements, you're lucky if they have any of what it says on the label. Furthermore, even for products actually containing bilberries at all, labeling was often uninformative, misleading, or both, something the herbal supplement market is infamous for. The largest study to date found that it appears that most herbal supplement labels lie. And who wouldn't want to eat this rather than this? It's interesting, bilberries gained notoriety during World War II, when it was said that pilots in the British Royal Air Force were eating bilberry jam to improve their night vision. It turns out this may have been a story concocted to fool the Germans. The real reason the Brits were able to all of a sudden target Nazi bombers in the middle of the night before they even made it to the English Channel was likely not because of bilberries, but because of a top-secret new invention they needed to keep quiet, called radar. Gestational diabetes, high blood sugar levels that develop when you're pregnant, is one of the most common complications of pregnancy. It's associated with abnormal fetal growth, infant mortality, preeclampsia, which can put the mom's health at risk, and various major birth defects. Is there anything we can do to prevent it? Well, the Harvard Nurses' Health Study found that eating meat before pregnancy appeared to increase subsequent diabetes risk during pregnancy. They suggest that the carcinogenic nitrosamines in bacon and other processed meats may be toxic to insulin-producing cells. This may be why ham and other lunch meats may play a role in initiating type 1 diabetes. But increased risk was also found for non-processed meat, too. So instead, it may be the glycotoxins, the advanced glycation end products formed in meat, causing inflammation, which has been tied to gestational diabetes. More recently, though, attention is turned to the blood-based heme iron in animal products. Higher pre-pregnancy intake of dietary heme iron is associated with an increased gestational diabetes risk. Now, we've known that the intake of heme iron from animal products was associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes in women, but we didn't know about the gestational diabetes until recently. Now, for type 2 diabetes, only animal-based iron was associated with diabetes risk. The more plant-based or non-heme iron was not. This is thought to be because our bodies can't regulate the absorption of the blood-based iron as well, and so chronically high intakes can lead to too much in the body. The same thing was found for gestational diabetes. Blood-based iron was associated with as much as triple the increased risk, but if anything, there was a trend towards the non-heme or plant-based iron being protective against diabetes. Either way, this explains why pregnant women who eat vegetarian appear to be at significantly lower risk of developing diabetes. But this study was in India, where vegetarians tend to avoid eggs as well. A more recent Harvard study found that higher pre-pregnancy intakes of animal fat and cholesterol was associated with elevated gestational diabetes risk. Substituting in 5% animal fat for 5% carbs was associated with a 13% increased risk of gestational diabetes. But if it's not just the animal fat, but the cholesterol too, then one would expect eggs to increase one's risk of diabetes during pregnancy as well, but it had never been directly studied until now. The risk of gestational diabetes in relation to maternal egg intake. Apparently, the more eggs women ate before getting pregnant and during early pregnancy, the higher their risk of developing diabetes during their pregnancies. And these findings are consistent with other studies documenting associations with cholesterol intake and the development of regular type 2 diabetes in men and non-pregnant women. In fact, women who develop gestational diabetes are like 7 times more likely to go on to develop type 2 diabetes later in life. So pregnancy is viewed as a teachable moment. pregnant women are often highly motivated to make healthy lifestyle changes for both their own health and that of their offspring. Thus, pregnancy may be a critical opportunity for both short and long-term behavioral modification, representing a window of opportunity for healthcare providers to change lifestyle patterns towards the acquisition of healthier habits. One of the most concerning developments in medicine is the emergence of bacterial superresistance. Resistance to not just one class of drugs like penicillin, but resistance to multiple classes of drugs, so-called multi-drug-resistant bacteria. In the 2013 FDA Retail Meat Report, more than a quarter of the salmonella found contaminating retail chicken breast were resistant to not one, but 5 or more different classes of antibiotic treatment drugs. Throughout history, there's been a continual battle between humans and pathogens. For the last half-century, that battle has taken the form of bugs versus drugs. First, we developed penicillin, and the U.S. Surgeon General declared the war against infectious diseases has been won. However, the euphoria over the potential conquest of infectious diseases was short-lived. In response, bacteria developed an enzyme that ate penicillin for breakfast, literally an enzyme that breaks down penicillin, called penicillinase. In fact, they can excrete large quantities of the enzyme, so it can destroy the drug before it even comes into contact. OK, so we developed a drug that blocks the penicillin-eating enzyme. That's why sometimes you see 2 drug names. One is the antibiotic, and the other is a drug that blocks the enzyme the bacteria uses to block the antibiotic. But the bacteria outsmarted us again, and so it goes back and forth. However hard we try and however clever we are, there's no question that organisms that have been around for 3 billion years and have adapted to survive under the most extreme conditions will always overcome whatever we decide to throw at them. So we went from first-generation antibiotics to second-generation antibiotics to third-generation antibiotics. But now we have bacteria that evolved the capacity to survive our big-gun third-generation cephalosporins like ceftriaxone, which is what we rely on to treat life-threatening salmonella infections in children. Where are these super-duper superbugs found? Almost 90% were isolated from chicken carcasses or retail chicken meat. But what if we only eat no antibiotic-added, organic chicken? A comparison of these multi-drug-resistant bacteria in organic and conventional retail chicken meat, the first such study ever published. All of the conventional chicken samples were contaminated. However, the majority, 84% of organic chicken meat samples, were also contaminated. So 100% versus 84%. Organic is definitely better, but odds are we'd still be buying something that could make our family sick. But where do these antibiotic-resistant bacteria come from if they're not using antibiotics on organic farms? A possible explanation is that the day-old chicks coming from the hatcheries are already infected before they arrive, or they can become contaminated after they leave in the slaughter plant. Organic chickens and conventionally raised chickens are typically all slaughtered in the same slaughterhouses, so there may be cross-contamination between carcasses. And finally, factory farms are dumping antibiotics and antibiotic-resistant bacteria-laden chicken manure out into the environment. You can pick up antibiotic-resistant genes right out of the soil around factory farms. So even meat raised without antibiotics may be contaminated with multi-drug-resistant bacteria. In a cover story in which Consumer Reports urged retailers to stop selling meat produced with antibiotics, they noted some store employee confusion, though maybe they were not so confused after all. An assistant store manager at one grocery store, when asked by a shopper for meats raised without antibiotics, responded, "Wait, you mean like veggie burgers?" Once in a while, I come across a study that's so juicy I do an entire video about it. It's like my which fruit fights cancer better video, or the best cooking method one, or that one comparing thousands of foods. Well, this is one such study. A group of researchers at U of F, Gainesville, and Penn State set up an elegant experiment. We've known ounce per ounce that herbs and spices have some of the greatest antioxidant activities known, but that's in a test tube. Before we can ask if an herb or spice has health benefits, it's first necessary to determine whether it's bioavailable. This has never been done until now. They could have went the easy route and just measured the change in antioxidant level in one's bloodstream before and after consumption, but the assumption that the appearance of antioxidant activity in the blood is an indicator of bioavailability has a weakness. Maybe more gets absorbed than we think, but doesn't show up on antioxidant tests because it gets bound up to protein or cells, so they attempted to measure physiological changes in the blood. They were interested in whether absorbed compounds would be able to protect white blood cells from an oxidative or inflammatory injury, whether it would protect the strands of our DNA from breaking when confronted by free radicals. They also wondered if the consumption of herbs and spices might alter cellular inflammatory responses in the presence of a physiologically relevant inflammatory insult. What does this all mean? Well, what they did was take a bunch of people and had each of them eat different types of spices for a week. There's so many really unique things about this study, but one was that the quantity that study subjects consumed was based on the usual levels of consumption in actual food. Like, the oregano group was given a half teaspoon a day, the kinds of practical quantities people might actually eat once in a while. Then at the end of the week, they drew blood from the dozen or so people they had adding black pepper to their diets that week, and compared the effects of their blood to the effects of the blood of the dozen on cayenne, or cinnamon, or cloves, or cumin. They had about 10 different groups of people eating about 10 different spices. Then they dripped their plasma, the liquid fraction of their blood, onto human white blood cells in a petri dish that had been exposed to an inflammatory insult. They wanted to pick something really inflammatory, so they chose oxidized cholesterol, which is like what you'd get in your bloodstream after eating something like fried chicken. So they jabbed the white blood cells with oxidized cholesterol, and then measured how much TNF they produced in response. Tumor necrosis factor is a powerful inflammatory cytokine, infamous for the role it plays in autoimmune attacks like inflammatory bowel disease. Compared to the blood of those who ate no spices for a week, was the blood of those eating black pepper able to significantly dampen the inflammatory response? No. What about any of these other spices? Cloves, ginger, rosemary, and turmeric were able to significantly stifle the inflammatory response. And remember, they weren't dripping the spices themselves on these human white blood cells, but the blood of those who ate the spices. And so it represents what might happen when cells in our body are exposed to the levels of spices that circulate in our bloodstream after normal daily consumption. Not megadoses in some pill, just the amount that makes our spaghetti sauce taste good, or our pumpkin pie, or curry sauce. There are drugs that can do the same thing. Tumor necrosis factors are such major mediators of inflammation and inflammation-related diseases that there are these TNF-blocking drugs on the market for the treatment of inflammatory diseases like osteoarthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis, ankylosing spondylitis, which rake in, collectively, more than $20 billion a year, because drug companies charge people $15,000 to $20,000 a year for the drug. At that price, the side effects better be hugs and rainbows, but no, these drugs carry a black label warning because they can cause things like cancer, heart failure. If only there were a cheaper, safer solution. Curcumin, the yellow pigment in turmeric, a spice that's a tad cheaper and safer. But does it work outside of a test tube? There's evidence that it may help in all the diseases for which TNF blockers are currently being used. And so with healthcare costs and safety being such major issues, this golden spice turmeric may help provide the solution. This landmark study, comparing the ability of different spices to suppress inflammation, also compared their ability to protect DNA. Cloves, ginger, rosemary, and turmeric were able to significantly stifle the inflammatory response, but what about DNA protection? If you take a tissue sample from some random person, around 7% of their cells may show evidence of DNA damage, actual breaks in the strands of their DNA. And if you blast those cells with free radicals, you can bring that number up to 10%. But if the person had been eating ginger for a week, that drops to just 8%. This is from a tissue sample taken from someone who hadn't been eating any herbs and spices, and as a result their cells were vulnerable to DNA damage from oxidative stress. But just including ginger in our diet may cut that damage 25%, and same with rosemary. But check out turmeric. DNA damage cut in half. Again, this is not just mixing turmeric with cells in some petri dish. This is comparing what happens when you expose the cells of spice eaters versus the cells of non-spice eaters to free radicals, and just sit back and count DNA fracture rates. And not only did the turmeric work significantly better, but a significantly smaller dose. This is comparing about 1 1/3 teaspoons a day of ginger or rosemary to practically just a pinch of turmeric, about 1/8 of a teaspoon a day. That's how powerful the stuff is. So I encourage everyone to cook with this wonderful spice. Tastes great and may protect our cells in our body, with or without the added stress. If you just count DNA breaks in people's cells before and after a week of spices without the free radical blast, we see no significant intrinsic protection in the ginger or rosemary groups. But the turmeric group still appeared to reduce DNA damage by half. This may be because curcumin is not just itself an antioxidant, but boosts the activity of our own antioxidant enzymes. Catalase is one of the most active enzymes in the body. Each one can detoxify millions of free radicals per second. And if you consume the equivalent of about 3/4 of a teaspoon of turmeric a day, the activity of this enzyme in our bloodstream gets boosted 75%. Now, why do I suggest cooking with it rather than just throwing it in a smoothie? Well, this effect was found specifically for heat-treated turmeric. Because in practice many herbs and spices are only consumed after cooking, they tested both turmeric and oregano in both raw and quote-unquote cooked forms. In terms of DNA damage, the results from raw turmeric did not reach statistical significance, though the opposite was found for the anti-inflammatory effects. So maybe we should eat it both ways. Practical recommendations for obtaining curcumin in the diet might be to add turmeric to sweet dishes containing cinnamon and ginger. I add it to my pumpkin pie smoothies, which are otherwise just a can of pumpkin, frozen cranberries, pitted dates, pumpkin pie spice, and some non-dairy milk. And also cook with curry powder or turmeric itself. They also suggest something called turmeric milk, which is evidently a traditional Indian elixir made with milk, turmeric powder, and sugar. I'd suggest substituting a healthier sweetener and a healthier milk. Soy milk, for example, might have a double benefit. If you're taking the turmeric to combat inflammation, compared to dairy protein, osteoarthritis sufferers randomized to soy protein ended up with significantly improved joint range of motion. According to the World Health Organization, 80% of the Earth's inhabitants rely upon traditional medicines for their primary healthcare needs, in part due to the high cost of Western pharmaceuticals. Medicines derived from plants have played a pivotal role in the healthcare of both ancient and modern cultures. One of the prime sources of plant-derived medicines is spices. Turmeric is one such spice, known around the world by different names, my favorite of which is probably Zard Chubag. Turmeric is the dried powdered rootstocks of the turmeric plant, a member of the ginger family, from which the orange-yellow pigment curcumin can be extracted. The spice turmeric is what makes curry powder yellow, and curcumin is what makes turmeric yellow. The molecule even looks cool. I always thought it kind of looked like a crab. Anyways, in recent years, more than 5,000 articles have been published in the medical literature about curcumin. Many sport impressive-looking diagrams suggesting curcumin can benefit a multitude of conditions via a dizzying array of mechanisms. Curcumin was first isolated more than a century ago, but out of the thousands of experiments, just a handful in the 20th century were clinical studies involving actual human participants. But since the turn of the century, more than 50 clinical trials have been done, testing curcumin against a variety of human diseases, with 84 more clinical trials on the way. But most of the 5,000 were just in vitro lab studies, which I've resisted covering until they moved more out of the petri dish and into the person. But this study got my attention. Rheumatoid arthritis is a chronic, systemic inflammatory disorder that causes progressive destruction of the cartilage and bone of joints. The long-term prognosis of RA is poor, with as much as 80% of patients affected becoming disabled, with a reduction of years in life expectancy. There's lots of drugs one can take, but unfortunately they're often associated with severe side effects, including blood loss and bone marrow suppression, and toxicity to the liver and eyes. There's got to be a better way. Well, the efficacy of curcumin was first demonstrated over 30 years ago. A double-blind crossover study, curcumin versus phenylbutazone, a powerful anti-inflammatory drug they use in racehorses. Both drugs showed significant improvement in morning stiffness, walking time, joint swelling, with a complete absence of any side effects in the curcumin group, which is more than can be said for phenylbutazone, which was pulled from the market 3 years later for wiping out some people's immune systems and their lives. Here's the latest. 45 patients diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis were randomized into 3 groups: curcumin, the standard of care drug, or both. The primary endpoint was a reduction in disease activity, as well as a reduction in joint tenderness and swelling. All 3 groups got better, but interestingly, the curcumin groups showed the highest percentage of improvement, significantly better than those in the drug group. The findings are significant, demonstrating that curcumin alone was not only safe and effective, but surprisingly more effective in alleviating pain compared to the leading drug of choice, all without any apparent adverse side effects. In fact, curcumin appeared protective, given that there were more adverse reactions in the drug group than the combined drug and curcumin group. In contrast to the nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, curcumin has no gastrointestinal side effects and may even protect the lining of the stomach. Osteoarthritis is the most frequent cause of physical disability among older adults in the world, affecting more than 20 million Americans, with 20% of us destined to be affected in coming decades, and becoming more and more widespread among younger people as well. Osteoarthritis is characterized by loss of cartilage in the joint. We used to think it was just mechanical wear and tear, but is now generally accepted as an active joint disease with a prominent inflammatory component, as evidenced by, for example, significantly higher production of inflammatory prostaglandins from tissue samples obtained from the knees of people suffering from the disease. If the loss of cartilage is caused in part by inflammation, might an anti-inflammatory diet help, like it does with rheumatoid arthritis? Using optimal nutrition and exercise as the first-line intervention in the management of chronic osteoarthritis could well constitute the best medical practice. Where's the best science on what optimal nutrition might look like? The China study is a prime example, showing the serious health consequences of high consumption of pro-inflammatory foods, meat, dairy, fat, and junk, and low consumption of anti-inflammatory plant foods, whole grains, vegetables, and fruits and beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils. The unnatural Western diet contributes to low-grade systemic inflammation and oxidative tissue stress and irritation, placing the immune system in an overactive state, a common denominator of conditions such as arthritis. There are phytonutrients in plants that appear to help decrease the degradation of the joint cartilage, the inflammatory activity, the cell death, and oxidative damage. This is based largely on in vitro studies, suggesting protective benefits of soy, and pomegranates, and citrus, and grapes, and green tea, and the curry powder spice turmeric. But my patients are people, not petri dishes. What role might the yellow pigment curcumin in turmeric play in the treatment of osteoarthritis? Well, obesity doesn't just put stress on our joints. Fatty tissue inside our joints, like in the kneecap itself, is a source of pro-inflammatory chemicals that have been shown to increase cartilage degradation. Curcumin may not only help prevent the release of inflammatory chemicals, but slow the formation of the fat pad in the first place. But enough with test tubes. There have been 2 clinical studies published to date. The latest took 50 patients suffering from moderate to mild knee osteoarthritis, and gave them either the best available medical treatment, which included control with anti-inflammatory drugs and painkillers, or the best available treatment along with some proprietary curcumin supplement. They looked at a number of different outcome measures, including the Karnofsky scale, which goes up to 100, which is normal, no complaints, no evidence of disease, down to 0, at which you're dead. The group with the added curcumin did significantly better, and were able to double their walking distance. This is the best medicine it had to offer, so Mother Nature made a counteroffer. The curcumin group was able to significantly decrease their drug use, significantly fewer side effects, less swelling, hospitalizations, and other treatments. But it doesn't have to be some fancy proprietary formula. Here's the other study: the efficacy of turmeric extracts in patients with knee osteoarthritis. About 100 sufferers were randomized to ibuprofen or concentrated turmeric extracts for 6 weeks, and the curcumin group did as good or better than the ibuprofen. Even though ibuprofen is over-the-counter, it can cause ulceration, bleeding, and perforation of the stomach and intestines, can eat right through our stomach wall, and in fact that happened to someone in the study. Whereas what are the side effects of curcumin? Potentially protecting against a long list of diseases. Historians from around the world have produced evidence to show that apparently all primitive peoples used herbs, often in a sophisticated way. Quinine from cinchona bark was used to treat the symptoms of malaria long before the disease was identified, and the raw ingredients of a common aspirin tablet have been a popular painkiller for far longer than we have had access to tablet-making machinery. Indeed, today, many pharmacological classes of drugs include a natural product prototype, which we originally discovered through the study of traditional cures and folk knowledge of indigenous people. There's a plant in South Asia called Adatoda. Adu means goat, and toda means not touch, because it's so bitter even the goats won't eat it. But it has compounds that help open one's airways, and as such, Adatoda tea has been used traditionally to treat asthma, where the leaves are steeped with black peppercorns. That sounds kind of gross to me. I mean, why would they do that? Because they're smart. Back in 1928, scientists discovered what the people evidently already knew, which was that adding pepper increased the anti-asthmatic properties of the leaves. Black pepper alone didn't work, it was the combination, and now we know why. Just like approximately 5% of the spice turmeric is this active compound called curcumin, about 5% of black pepper by weight is this compound called piperine. Curcumin is responsible for the yellow color of turmeric, and piperine for the pungent flavor of pepper. And it's a potent inhibitor of drug metabolism. One of the ways our liver gets rid of foreign substances is by making them water-soluble so they can be more easily excreted. But this black pepper molecule inhibits that process, and it doesn't take much. If you give people a bunch of turmeric curcumin, within an hour you can see a little bump in the level in their bloodstream. The reason we don't see more is that our liver is actively trying to get rid of it. But what if you suppress that process by taking just a quarter teaspoon's worth of black pepper? Then you see curcumin levels like this in the bloodstream. Same amount of curcumin consumed, but the bioavailability shoots up 2,000%. Even just a little pinch of pepper, 1/20th of a teaspoon, can significantly boost levels. And guess what a common ingredient in curry powder is besides turmeric? Black pepper. Another way to boost the absorption of curcumin is to consume it as the whole food, turmeric root, fresh or dried and powdered as turmeric, because natural oils found in turmeric root and turmeric powder can enhance the bioavailability of curcumin 7 to 8-fold. When eaten with fat, curcumin can be directly absorbed into the bloodstream through the lymphatic system, thereby in part kind of bypassing the liver. And how is it prepared in India? With fat, and black pepper. Right? Amazing how they could figure that out without double-blind trials, though maybe it just tasted good and was a coincidence. Their traditional knowledge certainly failed them with ghee, though, which is practically pure butter fat, which may explain their relatively high rates of heart disease despite all their turmeric. Following flax and wheatgrass, turmeric is the third best-selling botanical dietary supplement, racking up $12 million in sales and increasing at a rate of about 20%. Curcumin is a natural plant product extracted from turmeric root, used commonly as a food additive, popular for its pleasant mild aroma and exotic yellow color, considered unlikely to cause side effects. Just because something is natural, though, doesn't necessarily mean it's not toxic. Strychnine is natural, cyanide is natural, lead, mercury, and plutonium are all elements. Can't get more natural than that. But turmeric is just a plant. Plants can't be dangerous. Tell that to Socrates. In considering the validity of the widely accepted notion that complementary and alternative medicine is a safer approach to therapy, we must remind ourselves and our patients that a therapy that exerts a biological effect is, by definition, a drug and can have toxicity. It cannot be assumed that diet-derived agents will be innocuous when administered as pharmaceutical formulations at doses likely to exceed those consumed in the diet. Traditional Indian diets may include as much as a teaspoon of turmeric a day, which is the equivalent of about this much fresh turmeric root. If you look at the doses of turmeric that have been used in human studies, they range from less than a 1/16th of a teaspoon a day up to about 2 tablespoons a day for over a month, whereas the curcumin trials have used up to the amount found in cups of the spice, around 100 times more than what curry lovers have been eating for centuries. Still, without overt serious side effects in the short term at least, but if you combine both high-dose curcumin with black pepper for that 2,000% bioavailability boost, that could be like consuming the equivalent of 29 cups of turmeric a day. That kind of intake could bring peak blood levels up around here, where you start seeing some significant DNA damage, in vitro at least. So just incorporating turmeric into our cooking may be better than taking curcumin supplements, particularly during pregnancy. The only other contraindication cited in the most recent review was the potential to trigger gallbladder pain in people with gallstones. If anything, curcumin may help protect liver function and help prevent gallstones by acting as a cholecystokinetic agent, meaning it facilitates the pumping action of the gallbladder to keep the bile from stagnating. In this study, they gave people a small dose of curcumin, about the amount found like a 1/4 teaspoon of turmeric, and using ultrasound were able to visualize the gallbladder squeezing down in response, with an average change in volume about 29%. Optimally, though, you'd want to squeeze it in half, so they repeated the experiment with different doses, and it took about 40 milligrams to get a 50% contraction. That's about 1/3 of a teaspoon of turmeric every day. On one hand, that's great, totally doable. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, wow, that's some incredibly powerful stuff. What if you had a gallbladder obstruction? If you had a stone blocking your bile duct, and you eat something like that makes your gallbladder squeeze down that hard, it could hurt. So patients with biliary tract obstruction should be careful about consuming curcumin. But for everybody else, these results suggest that curcumin can effectively induce the gallbladder to empty, and thereby reduce the risk of gallstone formation in the first place, and ultimately perhaps even gallbladder cancer. Too much turmeric, though, may increase the risk of kidney stones. As I mentioned in a previous video, turmeric is high in soluble oxalates, which combine to calcium form insoluble calcium oxalate, which is responsible for approximately 3/4 of all kidney stones. So the consumption of even moderate amounts of turmeric would not be recommended for people with a tendency to form kidney stones. Such folks should restrict the consumption of total dietary oxalate to less than 40–50 milligrams a day, which means no more than at most a teaspoon of turmeric. So for example, those with gout are, by definition, it appears, at high risk for kidney stones, and so if their doctor wanted to treat gout inflammation with high-dose turmeric, then that's where curcumin supplements might come into play, because to reach high levels of curcumin in turmeric form would incur too much of an oxalate load. If one is prescribed a supplement, how do you choose? The latest review recommends purchasing from Western suppliers that follow recommended good manufacturing practices, which may decrease the likelihood of our buying an adulterated product. Concern has been expressed about the fact that cow's milk contains estrogens and could stimulate the growth of hormone-sensitive tumors. Concern that the consumption of dairy products could both promote the conversion of precancerous lesions or mutated cells to invasive cancer and enhance the progression of hormone-dependent tumors. This was initially postulated based on suggestive population scale data like this: a 25-fold increase in prostate cancer in Japan since the war. What was happening to their diets during that period? A 5, 10, 20-fold increase in eggs, meat, and dairy consumption, whereas the rest of their diet remained pretty stable. But diet wasn't the only major change in Japanese lifestyles over the latter half-century. Similarly, even though countries with higher milk consumption tend to have more prostate cancer deaths, and countries with lower milk consumption fewer deaths, there could be hundreds of confounding variables, but it certainly does spur interest in studying the possibility. This recent study represents the other extreme, controlling for as many factors as possible by just isolating prostate cancer cells out of the body in a petri dish and dripping cow's milk on them directly. They chose organic cow's milk because they wanted to exclude the effect of added hormones and just test the effect of all the growth and sex hormones found naturally in all milk. They found that cow's milk stimulated the growth of human prostate cancer cells in each of 14 separate experiments, producing an average increase in cancer growth rate of over 30%. In contrast, almond milk suppressed the growth of these cancer cells by over 30%. But just because something happens in a petri dish or a test tube doesn't mean the same thing happens in a person. It's just suggestive evidence that can be used in a grant application or something to get money to study actual people. There's kind of two main ways that's done: retrospective studies, looking back, where you take prostate cancer patients and figure out what they ate in the past, and prospective studies, looking forward, where you look at people's diets first and then follow them for a few years and see who gets cancer. The looking back kind are called case control studies, where they look at cases of cancer and compare their diets to controls. And the forward-looking kind are called cohort studies, because you're following a cohort of people forward. Then, if you want to get fancy, you can do a so-called meta-analysis, where you combine all the best studies done to date into one and see what the balance of available evidence shows. OK, so here we go. The latest meta-analysis of all the best case control studies ever done on the matter concludes that milk consumption is a risk factor for prostate cancer. And the latest meta-analysis of all the best cohort studies ever done also concludes that milk consumption is a risk factor for prostate cancer. An even newer study suggests that milk intake during adolescence may be particularly risky in terms of potentially setting one up for cancer later in life. Despite hormone-related cancers being among our top killers, as pointed out in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, we simply do not know which hormones and how much are in the food we ingest. More effort has been directed at the investigation of illicit use of designer steroids by Olympians and ball players than to the investigation of the effect of dietary hormones on cancer and other diseases that affect millions. A proposal is therefore made to monitor levels of steroid and other hormones and growth factors in all dairy and meat-containing foods, though to date this has not been done. The famous surgeon Dennis Burkitt is better known for his discovery of a childhood cancer, now known as Burkitt's lymphoma, than for his 1979 international bestseller, Don't Forget the Fiber in Your Diet. Anyone asked to list the 20 or more most important advances in health made in the last few decades would be likely to include none of what Dr. Burkitt considered to be among the most significant. What was the #1 most important advance in health according to one of the most famous medical figures of the 20th century? The fact that many of the major and commonest diseases in modern Western culture are universally rare in Third World communities, were uncommon even in the United States until after World War I, yet are now common in anyone following the Western lifestyle. So it's not genetic, they're lifestyle diseases, which means they must be potentially preventable. Those eating the standard American diet have high rates of all these diseases. Here are two examples. We had rates similar to that of the ruling white class in apartheid Africa, whereas the rates in the Bantu population, the rural Africans, were very low. These native Africans ate the same Three Sisters diet of many Native Americans, a plant-based diet centered around corn, beans, and squash. In fact, it was reported that cancer was so seldom seen in American Indians a century ago, they were considered practically immune to both cancer and heart disease. What is meant by very low rates among rural Africans? 1,300 autopsied over 5 years in a Bantu hospital, maybe one case of ischemic heart disease, our #1 killer. Their rates of heart and intestinal disease, similar to poor Indians, whereas wealthier Indians, who ate more animal and refined foods, were closer to those in Japan, until, of course, they moved to the US and started living like us. And you can do similar charts for all these other so-called Western diseases, which Burkitt thought related to the major dietary changes that followed the Industrial Revolution: a reduction in healthy plant foods, the source of starch and fiber, and a great increase in consumption of animal fats, salt, and sugar. His theory was that it was the fiber. None of these diseases, including our #1 killer, are common in communities where large soft stools are customarily passed. His thought was that all these major diseases may be caused by a diet deficient in whole plant foods, the only natural source of fiber. Fiber? In a survey of 2,000 Americans, over 95% of graduate school-educated participants and healthcare providers weren't even aware of the daily recommended fiber intake. Doctors just don't know. If a floor is flooded as a result of a dripping tap, it is of little use to mop up the floor unless the tap is turned off. The water from the tap represents the cost of disease. The flooded floor, the disease is filling up our hospital beds. Medical students learn far more about the methods of floor mopping than about turning off taps. And doctors who are specialists in mops and brushes can earn infinitely more than those dedicated to shutting off taps. And the drug companies sell rolls of paper towels, so patients can buy a new roll every day for the rest of their lives. To paraphrase Ogden Nash, modern medicine is making great progress, but just headed in the wrong direction. Preventive medicine is, frankly, bad for business. I talk a lot about numbers and statistics, but as the director of Yale's Prevention Research Center put it in a recent editorial, to reach doctors, our fellow colleagues, maybe we need to put a human face on it all. We have known for at least a decade that the leading causes of both premature death and persistent misery in our society are chronic diseases that are, in turn, attributable to the use of our feet, exercise, forks, diet, and fingers, smoking. Feet, forks, and fingers are the master levels of medical destiny for not just thousands of people on any one occasion, like a tsunami or earthquake, but the medical destiny of millions upon millions year after year. We as doctors, as a medical profession, have known. Ornish published 23 years ago, but we have not managed to care, at least not care deeply enough, to turn what we know into what we routinely do. Were we to do so, we might be able to eliminate most heart disease, strokes, diabetes, and cancer. But saving millions of lives is just a number. He asked doctors to forget the bland statistics of public health and ask ourselves if we love someone who has suffered a heart attack, stroke, cancer, or diabetes. Now imagine their faces, whisper their names. Recall what it felt like to get the news. And while we're at it, we can imagine the faces of others, imagining beloved faces. Now imagine if 8 out of 10 of us, wistfully reflecting on intimate love and loss, on personal anguish, never got that dreadful news because it never happened. Mom did not get cancer. Dad did not have a heart attack. Grandpa didn't have a stroke. Sister, brother, aunt, and uncle didn't lose a limb or kidney or eyes to diabetes. We are all intimately linked in a network of personal tragedy that need never have occurred, which leads to what he's asking doctors to do about it. Put a face on public health every chance you get when talking about heart disease and its prevention, or cancer, diabetes. Ask your audience to see in their mind's eye the face of a loved one affected by that condition. Then imagine that loved one among the 80% who need never have succumbed if what we knew as doctors were what we do. Invoke the mind's eye, he advises, and then bring a tear to it.